Chokeholds are not always physical. A chokehold is the unequal enforcement of environmental laws. A chokehold is the unequal distribution of wealth among environmental organizations. A chokehold is the unequal representation of BIPOC individuals in executive spaces. My name is Jamison Davis, co-founder of the Environmental Justice Law Society and current co-chair. The environmental organizations that we have applauded for years due to their conservation work in natural resources and wildlife have also perpetuated white supremacy and white superiority due to the fact that they have blatantly ignored the environmental racism and the burdens felt in the BIPOC community.
Hello, my name is Raya Salter, and I'm a climate and energy justice lawyer and activist. You're watching this, so I know that you care deeply about the earth, you care about humanity and the natural world, as do I. I'm recording this on Juneteenth weekend during this great rising for Black liberation, and I call on you right now to commit to the fight for climate and environmental justice.
Hey everyone, it's Dr. Mustafa Santiago Ali. Conservation justice, climate justice, racial justice, environmental justice. Justice is the foundation that our democracy is built upon.
Environmental organizations. We are living through a movement, one that has been a long time in the making. Environmental issues and climate change have never been, nor ever will be, just about climate or the environment. The lasting legacies of racial injustice and discriminatory policies permeate all facets of our society, from whose water is cleaner to who will fare well in a hotter world. It is structural, and it will take equal structural change to tear down.
And I am the treasurer of the Environmental Justice Law Society. Reading about the concerned citizens of South Central Los Angeles is what really solidified what environmental justice was. It was founded in 1985 by Black women who were concerned about a trash incinerator being installed in their neighborhood, and through their activism they were able to stop this incinerator from being built. And that kind of struck me as just truly unfair and grossly disrespectful of low-income communities where the pollution is offset onto those communities, and that I just thought that was terribly unjust, and that moment was really what started me on this.
Are a common threat to all of us. In this country, the people who breathe toxic air, drink poison water, perish from COVID disproportionately, and are murdered by the police with impunity are Black people, Indigenous people.
Injustice is the fact that the burdens of our society are put onto a minority of the population. Privileged communities don't have to see the waste that their way of life is producing. Those costs are put on other communities who don't have the same political power that the privileged white class does.
These communities are also the communities most likely to be pushed out as the seas rise and their communities gentrify to accommodate wealthier residents fleeing the floodwaters. As a researcher, I am concerned about how communities will deal with these changes in the midst of an affordable housing crisis. Where will people go when they can't afford to keep up with rising rents? Will they leave their currently low climate risk homes and migrate to a place where they will be at a higher risk to the effects of sea level rise?
Lower wealth communities, and Indigenous brothers and sisters. We know that as we fight to make sure that our planet is protected, the only way that we can ever win on climate change issues is to make sure that we're also focusing on environmental justice issues. We know disproportionately that the fossil fuel industry, that infrastructure, is placed primarily in communities of color.
I mean, I grew up in a very white state, so when I read about the concerned citizens of South Central Los Angeles, that really showed me the power of grassroots movements of women in the environmental justice movement. I was very environmentally conscious because of that, but I didn't see, I wasn't aware of environmental injustice until I began reading about it, until I became incensed by the injustice that certain people can have all the benefits of the industry, and other people bear all the costs for that.
Miami, where I live, is ground zero for climate change, and its racial history is well and alive. The legacy of redlining of Black communities extends right into which communities are underfunded and over-policed, bringing us to the point where
My
we
name
are
is
now.
Kendall Keelan, and I am the current co-chair of the Environmental Justice Law Society. One of the first times that I felt compelled to act with environmental justice was when I was in Argentina. I had the wonderful opportunity to study there for a semester, and I worked with a professor closely about indigenous rights, specifically in how the Argentine government failed to uplift and even acknowledge the indigenous communities there. And a big portion of the rural area in Argentina was excavated for the fossil fuel industry and for commercial agriculture, and these communities had a very hard time to maintain their right to the land, and so I felt that was a very important place for me to be.
We talk about liberty and justice for all, but we know that justice has been fleeting for many communities, and those of us who work in the environmental and conservation space know that in our history we have not always stood in solidarity with our most vulnerable communities, communities of color, lower wealth communities, and indigenous brothers and sisters. Those dumping grounds where we've allowed people to place everything that nobody else wanted, then there's a disinvestment that happens in that space. And when that disinvestment happens, people begin to see the folks who live there as less than human. And when we see folks being less than human, sometimes we see some actions playing out, like police coming into certain communities and doing things like shortening people's lives by choking them out. But we never see that in wealthier communities. And that's because we don't see disinvestment in those communities, and we don't see the dehumanization of people who live in those communities. So there is a direct connection that lives there.
When I was in Argentina, I had the opportunity to speak with two women from the Mapuche community, Laura and Marta. And these two women had not known that they were actually part Mapuche because the government and society had whitewashed their history and their culture. And these two women were describing how important their land is to their culture and their lives, and they actually found out that they were part Mapuche when the government tried to evict them from their land, and the government didn't have the right to do so because there was a law protecting them.
So my name is Sierra Suafoa McLean, and I'm the secretary for EJLS. Yeah, so it was in 2016, I believe, when my hometown of Tacoma, Washington was proposing to build a liquefied natural gas factory, and it was going to be on indigenous land, and a lot of people were within the danger area, but it was actually on Puyallup land, the indigenous land in our city, and it just made me feel like we were talking about the environmental harms of the liquefied natural gas factory, but we weren't talking about how this was on literally indigenous land and was going to have such a huge impact on their daily lives and how we honor their treaties. And so I felt like I needed to be involved because there was a part of the conversation that was simply being ignored.
As we fight to make sure that our planet is protected, the only way that we could ever win on climate change issues is to make sure that we're also focusing on environmental justice issues. We know disproportionately that the fossil fuel industry, that infrastructure, is placed primarily in communities of color, lower wealth communities, and sometimes on indigenous land. And that same pollution that is coming out of those stacks, that is polluting and shortening the lives of Black and brown communities, is that same pollution that is now warming up our oceans and our planets. So for us to not understand the connection that exists between the racial justice component and the work that we need to do to actually protect communities and to protect our planet means that we're going to have a gap in the process.
White supremacy put us in chains and stole indigenous lands. And the thread remains unbroken. These are the same forces that keep us imprisoned and hold that same land. These same systems that created these inequalities are maintaining the status quo for polluting corporations and the fossil fuel industry. It's that simple. Inequality and crimes against humanity and nature are our shared struggle.
It is time to recognize the importance of this movement and your role in designing change. The fate of our planet and our people are inextricably linked. The policy choices made decades ago cemented injustice for Black communities across America. So let's use this opportunity, this movement, to make a different choice. Let's design a different, equitable, and sustainable world.
I ask that you commit to self-transformation and commit to anti-racism. This is not a metaphor, it's a real process. Examine your own proximity to money and power. Center Black and Indigenous leadership. This includes the Black and Indigenous people who work in your own organizations. If you're a Black or Indigenous person listening to this, I want to encourage you to feel secure in your power. We can heal, we can do this together, we can grow this movement.
Are we willing in the 21st century to actually stand up and do the right thing? Are we willing to stand in solidarity with the communities who have often been unseen and unheard? And are we willing to evolve our organizations to make sure that they are moving in the direction that the culture is moving in our country? One that is focused on equality, one that is focused on equity, one that is focused on justice.